Hi everyone, my name's Darryl Panes, CEO at As Good as Gold Australia, and today once again I'm joined by my brother Brian, and partner at As Good as Gold. And this afternoon we interviewed John Adams, Chief Economist at As Good as Gold Australia. How are you, John?
I'm doing well, Darryl and Brian. How are you today?
Very well, John, and good afternoon.
John, welcome back. Welcome back to a world gone mad. A world where stock markets and property markets, this is really interesting, remain at all-time highs, and yet business closures remain at all-time highs at the same time. I mean, that really makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, hard to work out.
Makes no sense at all, Brian, and that's the point. And to the degree that business and economic fundamentals are being completely ignored. Danger signs ahead. We've been saying that for a while, but you just can't ignore this. And so at this point, I'd like to remind everybody of a very famous quote, I felt it was at the time, by a gentleman that we hold in high regard, Vern Gowdy. And Vern said, and you can remember this, I'm sure, Brian, that there's only one way that he knows how you can go broke, and that's to have too much debt. And that brings me to Evergrande again. I mean, I've brought this up and we've spoken at length about Evergrande with a number of people that we've interviewed. And I wanted to get John's take on this today because Evergrande is a massive property developer in China with massive debt. They're facing a $300 billion in liabilities. They just averted a default last week when it paid $83.5 million interest payment on a dollar-denominated bond. Its next deadline is October 29. That's today. And this time it's $45.2 million interest commitment. They should have paid it on September 29, so they'd be given a month's grace.
Right.
Once again. So they're into this habit at the moment. So if they default from this, John, they cannot borrow any funds from any overseas financial institutions. They're limited to borrowings from within China. They are currently 24 hours away from another default, or a potential default, I should say. This isn't going away, John. My question to you is, where do Evergrande go from here?
Thanks for the question, Darryl. Hot off the press is what I can say is that about half an hour before we started recording this interview, the news has come out of China that the latest bond payment has been met. So they have averted default again. The financial system, the Chinese economy can breathe a sigh of relief for now, but the systemic problems at Evergrande will continue. So as you said, more than $300 billion US in liabilities. In Australian dollars, it's north of 400 billion. As we go into November, they have to make bond coupon payments in the order of $338 million US. So we think about last week, which was about 83 million. This week, 45 million. So there was a lot of nervousness as to whether they can meet these obligations. But now we get into a much larger cash flow obligation for November. The big surprising thing is in the last couple of weeks is, if they're cash strapped and they can't make these payments, well, where is this money coming from? So it looks like they have a secret line of funding. My suspicion is it's coming from either the People's Bank of China, their central bank, or from the government directly in terms of the Chinese treasury. And that's how they've been able to make these bond payments. And so far for October, so good. Now, they have been promising restructuring. So I do think that part of what they're trying to do with, they're kicking the can down the road with these last minute bond coupon payments. So I think that's just going to give them more time to restructure the company, and obviously that means they have to restructure some of the debt. So there should be, or there will be, some losses for bondholders, but how much and in what form? So far, that hasn't manifested itself. But obviously, the interesting question with Evergrande is it big enough to sink the entire property sector? So Evergrande, in and of itself, is 1% of the Chinese economy, which is large for one company. And then obviously, when you look at the property sector is about a third of the Chinese economy. So Beijing says that Evergrande is containable. Beijing says that Evergrande's not going to bring down the Chinese financial system or the economy as a whole. I think Western analysts are more skeptical about those statements. But it's still a very precarious position. And one of the things with debt, and even back in say 2018 when I was roaming around federal parliament in Canberra and talking to federal parliamentarians about Australia's debt problem in terms of household debt, one thing I said to these politicians, I said that if you think that you can one day wake up and just imagine this debt has disappeared, you're living in fairyland. I mean, once you've got debt, and you've got to resolve it in some real way. And that's true for Australia. That's true for China. So this debt problem's not going to go away for Evergrande. Now, it is interesting that for the last probably 6 weeks, they stopped construction across the whole because of their financing problems. The Chinese government in particular is very focused on ensuring that mum and dad investors get their apartments built so that they can move in and they don't lose out on their investment. So I think from a political point of view, the Communist Party in China is very focused on retail investors and making sure that they are happy. So in that context, Evergrande has been instructed by the Chinese Communist Party to resume construction. And in the last fortnight, construction on some of their projects have recommenced. So there is some positive signs there, but again, I don't think they've clearly come out with a convincing plan as to how do they meet their obligations in November. And once we get into 2022, the amount of debt that Evergrande has to meet in terms of their obligations, I mean, it's not just a few tens of millions here or 100 millions there. There's in the order of I think $5 to $7 billion worth of bonds they have to meet in 2022. So, they have some big challenges. And, they are, I think, working through how they kind of resolve that. But so far, no clear plan. And I think that creates a lot of nervousness and uncertainty. And, so I think this is going to be a rolling panic week by week. Some weeks we think it's okay. Some weeks we think it's going to be, about to collapse. And that's obviously going to create a more turbulent economy, a more turbulent market, and it obviously makes great for financial newspapers that just want to get eyeballs reading their content.
As I read it, and we've talked about Evergrande, and sure they're massive, but it's bigger than that. It's much bigger than Evergrande. I mean, this $5 trillion property sector, John, accounts for around a quarter of the Chinese economy. It's roughly equivalent to the whole output of the Japanese economy, which is ranked third in the world. It's estimated that a third of China's property developers will struggle to pay their debts in the next 12 months. So that's around $92 billion in bond payments mature. So just recently, Sinic Holdings, Fantasia Holdings, and the China Properties Group all went into default. The fear, of course, is contagion. We're talking about the domino effect, not just affecting China in this case, but the world's financial markets. Because what people don't understand, or a lot don't understand, is that there's a lot of international money invested in China with these companies. So then there's the microscope that focuses directly on these companies, not just in China, but all around the world. And so lending criteria stiffens up. These companies' ability to borrow money really starts to stiffen up. So the question's got to be, will the Chinese government bail them out, or will they allow them to fail? because a lot of these companies are going to go under. So whether they bail them out or whether they allow them to fail, massive ramifications either way. Which way do you think it'll go, John? What are your thoughts?
In terms of some of those companies that you mentioned, Darryl, that have already gone into default, I mean, when you look at the size of them, I mean, they're only in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars as opposed to billions of dollars. So they are quite small compared to Evergrande. It would. I mean, look, I'd make a couple of observations. The first one is the Chinese government is seeking to diversify the economy. So I think they realize that they are overinvested in property. In terms of look from a macro perspective, and that there's too much debt tied to housing and to property, etc., and in apartments. So I think they want to move away from that. That's why they've imposed quite a few restrictions on developers in terms of what they can borrow, and they've put restrictions on banks as to what they can lend. So we are seeing a transition process where less resources will be allocated to property moving forward. And that's obviously going to mean that some players will have to go bust. So I think that, and it would make sense to me that they would allow quite a few small fish to go under because the broader economy can handle that. But the big ones like Evergrande, they can't let them go under because they're too big to fail. And the interesting thing with Evergrande just in the last week was that the Communist Party has actually ordered their founder and CEO to put some of his personal wealth back into the company. I think there was a story that maybe in the last decade he took $1 billion of dividends and left the company embroiled with massive debts. And now the government's saying to that CEO, how about you put some of that $1 billion you basically took from the company in dividends and actually meet some of these debts that you incurred. And to be honest, even though I'm not a communist, I actually think that's quite refreshing. I mean, you see in the American system where executives saddle a company with debt. They take all their fees, they take their dividends, and then they walk away from the company and let it collapse and leave a whole bunch of mess in its wake. Whereas now the Chinese are basically saying, if you are an executive, if you're a shareholder and you've actually benefited during the period that debt has been incurred, well, we're actually going to hold you accountable, and we want you to actually use some of your own wealth to actually ensure that that your company doesn't go bust. And I do think there needs to be some level of accountability from executives and from shareholders that they just can't rack up exorbitant debts, allow it to collapse, and then let millions, if not billions, of people in its wake suffer the consequences. And that, from a capitalistic point of view, I mean, capitalism, capitalism at its heart, it's all about risking capital, and then if you fail in that achievement of that endeavor, then you suffer the consequences because you took the risk. So I think that's what China's trying to say to its founder of Evergrande. You took risk. If the company fails, you will fail as well. You're not going to walk away with your billions of dollars of wealth. You're going to face the music as well. And that, I think, is healthy in a capitalistic free market economy.
Well, so do I, John, but I don't think every CEO in China is going to respond positively to that request. I think there's
the only thing I will say, Darryl, is that unlike the West, where a government may give some sort of nudge to a CEO, in China the CCP is in full control. So when the CCP says to a CEO, "You will put your money back into the company," without being too controversial, we know what happens when you don't listen to the CCP.
Well, the CEO had better have it, not have spent it. I think there's a lot left to the story, John. I really do believe that we're going to hear a lot more about this debacle in China over the coming months. And so watch this space.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
John, we're going to change the subject just a little bit. As you know, in the last month or so, we're starting to get a little bit of freedom, because we've been locked down, especially Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, for such a long time. But freedom, as I see it, is very, very costly. So what I'm going to do right now is read 3 quotes. And what I love about quotes is that they come from history. You don't quote what's in the future, right? Because you don't know the future. But these quotes are all about debt, all about having your freedoms. So once I've made these 3 quotes, I'm then going to ask you a question that each question, the same question for each quote. So here I go. Quote 1. A government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take away everything that you have. And for that particular quote, which is outstanding, the author is unknown, but the next 2, they're not. Then the second quote. Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. When you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or the other, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. Now that quote was done by author James Garfield, teacher, preacher, and the 20th President of the United States in the year 1881. Now, I remember 1881 is 20 years before the Federal Reserve was formed. Quote 3. You may have seen this on our screen, but the desire of gold is not for gold, it is for the means of freedom and benefit. Author Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, I wrote down this after talking and thinking about those 3 quotes, and this is what I've said. We're talking about Australia. We have endured the loss of our freedoms, the control of industry and commerce, and have lost our ability to choose where we work and if we work, with the associated work satisfaction. Many have been discriminated against. Now, John, the question, could you describe how saving in precious metals gives anybody a better chance of a better future?
I mean, thank you for those quotes, Brian. I mean, look, you've really covered some interesting landscape, and you really touched on a couple of really interesting concepts that I think are worth exploring in terms of our audience. So in terms of the first quote, we talk about that a government that is big enough to give you everything is big enough to take everything away from you. I mean, we've seen this throughout history. We see periods where when a government grows in its power, all it wants to do is protect that power and not give that power back to its citizenry. And so, how does that happen? That you get more laws, you get more bureaucrats, you get a bigger military, you get more police force, and then you have this distortion in terms of in terms of how much force does the government have in terms of its ability to physically make the citizenry do something versus the people's ability to protest or to revolt or to fight back. And so there are, I mean, the essence of freedom, and we can take some big lessons from the American Revolution in particular, is you need a government that is constrained in its power, and that power has to be constrained in all aspects. So while a lot of Australians believe that it's a good thing that we have a welfare state and that we have payments for the disadvantaged, well, when government gives money out and people become dependent on the government, well, the government then has to find that money from somewhere. So how does it get? It gets through taxes. It gets through the expansion of the money supply, and then with that power, they start to do all sorts of other things that basically grow and encroach and solidify that power. So we have a lot of people employed in Australia who are bureaucrats. We have police that have militarized weapons. We've seen the last 12 months that the military has been deployed in Victoria and New South Wales in particular, and citizens don't have means of resisting if they wish to resist, particularly since Port Arthur, where we lost the right for automatic and semi-automatic weapons. So we have really had a confronting time, particularly in the last 18 months in Australia, in terms of, what are our rights? Because I think a lot of Australians have made some assumptions that as Australians we do believe that we do have some rights, but as we've been able to see, that from particularly in the context of state constitutions, governments in this country have basically little checks or controls, and when they want to impose coercive policies on their citizens, whether it's lockdowns or curfews or border closures, and in terms of mask mandates, etc. They have all the legal and constitutional power to implement those sort of policies, and there is nothing restraining them. And there's been multiple attempts through legal action and courts to say to the government, hey, you've done these things, but you actually don't have the legal power to do them. And the judges have basically said, no, in fact, they actually do have the power. So what you don't want, and history informs us of this, is you don't want a government that's unrestrained and that they become too powerful, that their power is just untouchable, and then citizens, that they lose out in terms of their economic freedom, political freedom, civil rights, and the ability to prosper in a healthier economy. And I think Australia is learning, unfortunately, what happens when you don't pay attention to a growing government, and that government gets too big, too strong, and you can't do anything to constrain it, because their power is absolute, and particularly in Victoria.
I have noticed that economic freedoms have been taken away quite considerably, and that is why ourselves as good as gold. I mean, we've been saving in gold and silver for 20 years. People have known that by now. We've said it a number of times. But how does that affect? How does saving gold and silver actually help you? Basically, if your bank account is if the governments can get big enough, they can control your bank accounts. And if you haven't got any currency to change or to do a transaction with, you are really in no man's land. And I'm sure that everybody agree, by having a bit of gold and silver as a secondary type of money, right? It should be the first type, but at least it's equal to fiat, or better than fiat. But by having some, you'll be able to do a transaction, and you'll be able to change a monetary transaction with a company or an individual person. So thanks, John, for that particular answer. Let's move on to the next quote. I'll say it again. Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is an absolute master of all industry and commerce. When you realise that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or the other by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. I'm basically I look at that quote and I say, do we need a central bank? Does any country need a central bank? John, what's your take on that?
So particularly when you have a fiat currency system, so when in history we've had a gold standard or a silver standard, the money supply is relatively stable. And how do you generate economic growth in a state with a stable money supply? You've got to basically do what we did in the 19th century, which is save and invest, and actually be productive, and invest in new enterprises and technology, and basically through that investment, that's how you get real economic growth. But when you have a fiat currency system, well, what you can do is you can create more money, get people to borrow more, and then from there, that borrowing can then be either invested, it can be consumed, and then you get into an economic model that is driven by debt, and that's has happened right throughout history, and that's why you end up in hyperinflation, because you create too much money and the fiat currency loses too much value. And so in the current system that we are in, particularly since 1971, commercial banks and the central bank really are the masters of the economy, because by expanding or contracting the money supply, they can dictate, whether we're growing or whether we're shrinking, and that has in much more stronger influence than prime ministers or presidents or parliaments in terms of where the direction of the economy is going to go. So obviously in the context of this quote, and obviously there's been a whole bunch of other politicians and libertarians and economists who have also made comments about and it could have also been, I think, Milton Friedman or Margaret Thatcher. They've also said that the most important decision of a government is the control of the money supply, because it is so central to how economy responds, whether people borrow and invest and incomes go up and people actually are more prosperous, or if the money supply contracts. You basically have periods of high unemployment. So obviously, when you have that sort of power, the question then becomes well, who holds that power? Is that the elected officials, or is that a central and unaccountable central bank, or is that the CEOs of a whole host of large commercial banks? I think in the modern era, we are seeing that central banks and commercial banks, particularly when it comes to the direction of the economy, have way more influence and power in terms of the economy, and then obviously by having that influence over the economy, they then use that power to influence politicians to do whatever they want, and that's when you get this unbalance of an unrepresentative oligarchy that's actually guiding the economy versus the elected representatives that basically get elected when you have a democratic election. So that's basically my take on that, and that's obviously why I think we had a banking royal commission. There were some there were some things that were exposed. There were some reforms that have come on there, but I think we need a vigilant citizenry. We need a vigilant parliament to keep a close eye on the Reserve Bank of Australia, the commercial banks, and making sure that we do have a healthy, functioning banking system and a monetary system, but that power that those individuals hold is checked. They follow the law, and that at the end of the day, those with the power are responsive to the will of the people, and that they act in the public interest.
I look at that quote, and authored by James Garfield, as I said, the President of the United States in 1881. I know that in the United States in the I think between 1810 and 1820, they had their first central bank. Then it was squashed, and then they had another central bank in the 1830s. That was squashed, I think, after 8 years. Then they had the Civil War, but after the Civil War, the actual economy of the United States went gangbusters. No central bank, all the money was gold and silver, and you couldn't stop the United States from booming ahead. So a very, very, very interesting quote from a president that took over there. The last one, and we may have answered it, but if you could have any more comments, we'd love to have them. The desire of gold is not for gold. It is for the means of freedom and benefit. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Any extra comments on that?
A lot of us, without, I guess, being too controversial given the platform we're speaking on, a lot of Australians in the last 12 months have been forced, largely due to financial necessity, to make a whole host of decisions about their lives that in normal circumstances they would not make. And there are some things we can't talk about for obvious reasons, but one thing I can say, and I'll let you and Darryl speak for yourself, is that because in 2018 I published a 10-point plan of how to prepare for economic Armageddon on news.com.au, and there were some financial tips, there were some non-financial tips, but that plan I've followed in terms of my personal life. And when you have a clean balance sheet, when you have no debt, when you have savings, when you have strong cash flow management, when you have a reasonable amount of precious metals, it gives you options. It gives you choices. You're not under financial pressure. So in terms of this quote, when it says gold is about freedom and benefit, well, the freedom is the freedom of choice. If you're not financially constrained because you don't have buffers, well, you have the freedom to follow the crowd, or you have the freedom not to follow the crowd, and you've got the freedom, if the government is saying that you must do certain things. Well, if you have the financial means not to follow the government's direction, and I have those means not to follow the government's direction, I have the choice, I have the flexibility and the freedom and the option not to follow what the government is telling me to do, and that's what I've been doing in the last 6 months. And obviously, precious metals is a central component of my family's portfolio, and those precious metals gives us an anchor to be able to pursue the life that we want. I mean, Darryl continues to quote his mentor and talk about being able to party while everyone else can't. Well, in the last few months, while it's been a tumultuous time here in New South Wales, not to say that I've been partying, but I've been able to stand and live another day, whereas a whole bunch of people have felt compelled because of financial necessity to do things that they didn't want to do because they thought they had no financial option. And a lot of that's driven by excess debt, not enough savings, and no precious metals. So I think that's what the benefit of gold and silver is. And the other thing I would say about this quote, Brian, is that in times of economic distress, whether it's hyperinflation or war or even in a pandemic or in some sort of crisis, because gold and silver hold their value and because they are universally in demand, it doesn't matter whether the government prints trillions of dollars of new currency. Your wealth gives you options because it will be universally accepted around the world. So I think they're the key points around it. And again, for those people watching this interview who have been forced to make uncomfortable decisions in the last 18 months here in Australia because they had no other choice, well, getting yourself into good financial shape and getting precious metals gives you flexibility and options. So when that crisis point comes, you have a rainy day fund or a rainy day option that gives you a way to basically resist and to live the life that you think you want to live.
Yeah, that's so very true. Thank you, John.
It does definitely provide options. I've been using gold and silver as money, as a medium of exchange, John, and you know this anyway, but for the last 5 years. I've tested the water and I've just educated people that provide goods and services. Most of these people are owner-operator businesses it's the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. But whether that be the car serviceman, the guy that beats the panel beater, just in case your wife has an accident, not me, of course, but then the car needs to be attended to. All of these payments have been made in gold and silver. And can you imagine what it's going to be like in another 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? You're going to have people in all sorts of varying businesses that are going to be keen to take your gold or silver as a medium of exchange for their services.
Yeah.
So it just provides you, it's just another option that you've got. Unlimited option in reality if you've been saving in precious metals.
Yeah, and even more so if we go down the direction of digital currency situations.
Sure.
So it's a massive advantage to have a percentage of gold and silver.
Oh yeah. I just want to comment on something that the point that you made, Brian. A government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take away everything that you have. And we've spoken about it anyway, but it's interesting that past 19 months, of course, since March 2020, Australia has adopted a range of extreme policies, stopping people's mobility, including lockdowns, social distancing, border closures, all of that, all due to COVID-19, of course. And this was all based on the assumption, Brian, that COVID-19 spreads primarily from person to person. That's why they did it.
Yeah.
But here we go. The last few days have highlighted a very, very interesting point.
What have you found?
Well, New South Wales epidemiologists have been predicting for months that COVID-19 would explode once the state emerges from lockdown and people start moving around. However, we've had a strange reaction to this. This has not occurred. John, can you please explain? You're a New South Welshman. What is going on with COVID-19 in New South Wales at the moment?
we have a very interesting scientific case study that's underway here in my state. Now, people can go to my personal website, adamseconomics.com, and they'll see that I've written a couple of lengthy essays about COVID-19, and those essays have also been published on the As Good as Gold Australia website. There is a scientific controversy among a range of different scientists, physicists, epidemiologists, infectious disease experts, as to where do viruses come from and how do they spread. So the funny thing is, 700 years ago in Europe, the thinking in Europe was that viruses come from the air, that they come from like in terms of an atmospheric infection. Now in India, 700 years ago, they said it comes from rats. So this was this whole idea of animal to person spread. Now, since in the last 100 years, since the evolution of germ theory in science, the primary thinking is that viruses come from some sort of source, some sort of animal source, a bat, a pangolin, a rat, etc. And once it starts infecting humans pass it from person to person. So the way you stop a virus from spreading is you say to people, stop moving, stop interacting, stay in your homes. So that's why we've done those policies that you suggested, Darryl, about lockdowns and social distancing and obviously masks and border closures. This is all about stopping people mobility, because this is how you suppress a virus and obviously stop its growth. Now, and these policies controversially have been implemented in a whole host of countries around the world, but particularly in the Western world, in the UK, in parts of Europe, obviously Australia, New Zealand, and obviously Canada and parts of the United States. Now, there's been all sorts of reactions to these policies, from controversies in science to wild conspiracy theories, but that's the essence of why we've done what we've done, and it's caused enormous hardship for millions of people in this country, both economic and psychological. Children not being able to go to school, marriages that haven't been able to survive because of these restrictive policies, and it's turned people's lives upside down for the last 2 years. Now, starting in about August of this year, we had the politicians in New South Wales, the former Premier Berejiklian, and then in early October, the new Premier Perrottet. We've had the Chief Health Officer, Dr. Kerry Chant. We've had a whole host of epidemiologists from around the country all say the same thing, that once you emerge from lockdown, cases, hospitalization, and ICU, so intensive care admissions, will go up, irrespective of vaccine coverage rates, because people are going to be moving about. So in the second essay that I published only in the last week, I've got a long table with all of the quotes from reports to media articles to statements at the political press conferences, with this whole notion of a person-to-person infection model has been articulated, and they all said that, well, a number of them said that October will be the worst month in New South Wales in terms of, there was a quote from the former Premier that the hospital system will be, quite technically overwhelmed. ICU admissions will go through the roof. It'll be dark days, challenging days in New South Wales in October. And then obviously there's been other epidemiological reports saying that that COVID will peak by Christmas in New South Wales, because it's going to take a bit of time for the virus to really spread through the community. Well, I think we have a few charts that we're going to put up now that we can go through. But basically, in essence, what I've done is I've created my own data set using the data from New South Wales Health. And what we can see is that from mid-September, nominal cases of COVID-19 in New South Wales has actually gone down. When you look at the rate of tests that come back positive, so because obviously when you look at the number of cases per day, I mean, that has to be, one thing you've got to control for is the changing level of testing, because some days you have high level of testing, some days you have low level of testing, and obviously those days where you have low level of testing in terms of number of tests, you'll obviously have a lower number of positive infections. But if you account for the level of testing. Well, since the 5th of October, the rate of tests that come back positive with COVID-19 positive testing results has fallen away since early September. And then when you look at hospitalization and ICU admissions, well, they peaked on the 21st of September, and they keep on going down. So here we are. So we're speaking on a Friday. This is the third Friday since we emerged from the lockdown. Now, some of these epidemiologists said it's going to take a 2 or 3 weeks for the data to show that it's going up. Well, we've almost completed 3 weeks and it's still going down. So, we will have to see what happens in the next 6 weeks, in the next 8 weeks as we head towards Christmas. But if what I expect is going to happen, that ICU hospitalization and cases continue to fall, it would say to me that mainstream epidemiologists have got the science wrong. Politicians implemented the wrong policies based on bad science, and we've completely mismanaged the pandemic and caused unnecessary economic and psychological and social harm that didn't have to be done. Now, these obviously are controversial statements, but I do think that people need to keep a close eye on what happens in New South Wales and review the record of all these forecasts. And you've just got to ask yourself, how could these forecasts be wrong? Now, people are starting to offer a whole range of different examples, from warm weather to high vaccine coverage to a number of other possible explanations. But no one's actually going back to say, well, did we actually get the infection model wrong? I mean, does it actually, is the primary driver of COVID-19 person to person, or is it actually something else? So there's a group of scientists that I've been dealing with for the last 20 months who have a very different interpretation, and I've become persuaded with their line of thinking. And these scientists are an international group, and they publish peer-reviewed work, and so far their analysis, which would suggest that COVID was going to fall in New South Wales when we open up, not go up, which is what the mainstream consensus was, so far it's playing out. And so I think it's a very important scientific test case as we go forward. And if in the wash it comes out that New South Wales and Australia implemented some of the most horrendous totalitarian policies based on bad and misguided science, I think it's going to be one of the worst scientific controversies in terms of Australian history. And I think that will have some significant repercussions in the years to come.
Yeah, I'm once again, Brian, very, very glad that I am holding precious metals. I know we keep saying it, and it is our business, but what I have learned is not to argue or debate history. History is a wonderful supply of information, and it should never be ignored. You know, during times of uncertainty, volatility, economic downturns, gold and silver always prevail. 5,000 years of history keeps telling us that. And I constantly refer to an illustration that I give, gold versus real estate. I want to share this again, because every time I do, when I do it in a private presentation, the person looks at me and says, "You've got to be kidding. How is that possible? That gold outperforms real estate, has done so monotonously for 20 odd years. So how does that work?" I just forward people to a graph if they don't believe me, because it's there, it's factual, it's there in black and white. Here's how it works. Let's say you had $500,000 and you invested into gold. Let's say you did that over the last 20 years. You could have done it 20 years ago, from 2000 right through till now. Put $500,000 into gold. The increase rate of growth, Brian, and you know this, of course, 558% over that period of time. It's 27.1% annual growth. Now let's just take the $500,000 for the moment. If it just grew at 20% per annum, you'd have $1 million there after 5 years. And then if you decided in retirement that it was time for you to start liquidating what you'd saved, you could do so at the rate of 20%, which is $200,000 a year. Now, at 27.1%, you've got more left in the kitty at the end of each year than what there was at the start of that year. So in reality, you could do that infinitum. So as a retiree, you could withdraw over $200,000 a year with monotonous regularity. Now, I don't know, but you look at real estate, and I know real estate gets a really good plugging. Okay, because governments love real estate. It employs a lot of people. Mainstream media love getting behind it for the same reasons. And they work at this together. But bottom line is, if you had that $500,000 and you put it into a property and you left it there for 5 years, and it grew at the rate of 20%, and that would be rare, you'd have $1 million or have $1 million property at the end of 5 years. Okay, so if you decide to rent that property because it represents an income to you, then you'd expect to get somewhere around $35,000, $40,000 a year as a rental return before your outgoings. What would your outgoings be? Somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 a year. So you'd be looking at something like $25,000 net return on your investment. $25,000 versus $200,000. I present my case, and most of the people that I speak to are speechless. They cannot believe this, but they are the facts, and anybody can check them out. So that's the position that Brian and I placed ourselves in many years ago. We said, well, if you've got $1 million, it's $200,000. You've got $2 million, it's $400,000 a year. It goes on and on. But you don't have to have that, of course. The reason I selected $500,000 was because a lot of people invest in a property or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or 10, and that's the sort of money that they're investing. Now, I haven't just mentioned silver for a moment. I mean, silver, with the ratio, it's sitting at the moment at something like 75 to 1, 75 ounces of silver to buy an ounce of gold. It's highly likely, based on historical evidence, once again, that we're going to see silver close that gap. It did from 126 to 1, say something like 17 months ago. It's closed into 75. It will continue. It always does. Historically, it always does. And so the expectation is we're looking at seeing it around 35 to 1. So you're going to make twice as much out of silver as you do out of gold. I mean, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? No, it's a no-brainer.
That's exactly right. You just can't distort the truth, because they are the truth figures.
No. So, we talk about gold as insurance. Well, that's true. It's fantastic insurance in times of economic turbulence, but it's much better than that. It can become a great investment as well. John, before we close off today, any closing comments from yourself?
All I can say, Darryl, is that, it has been a very tough period for the last 20 months. New South Wales is more open than it was a few months ago. I am in Sydney today. People are out and about. We are getting back to normal. I think you can speak for yourself in terms of South Australia. You've had a couple of brief lockdowns, but nothing like the East Coast. So you guys have been relatively untouched. I think Melbourne is about to reopen, and there'll be a big question as to how long will these policies go for. I mean, these restrictive policies going forward, they have been based on this whole premise of a person-to-person spread model, and that COVID was going to escalate as we open up. Well, as we move forward and COVID doesn't come out like it is in New South Wales, I think particularly in New South Wales, I think we could quickly go back to pre-pandemic levels, and I think we have the political leadership in New South Wales that will give us that opportunity. But in its wake has left a generational debt that we can't resolve without enormous pain, and that is something as we go back to normal, as people try to rebuild their lives, particularly in the small business community. There will have to be some sort of societal discussion as to how do we pick up the pieces from destroying the central bank balance sheet to now having rampant inflation in property, to having the federal government and the state governments drowning in public sector debt, and that is a big question that Australia has to try to resolve. And I don't think so far we've even contemplated what that actually means in terms of getting on top of. So I think in the immediate term there are some positive signals. I think in the medium term the problems that we had before the pandemic have been exaggerated, also they've exacerbated, and that will mean that there'll be unfortunately tougher times in the future, particularly for those who don't have their financial house in order. So I think there's important work for As Good as Gold to do in 2022 as we try to explain how bad the economic situation is in this country, and hopefully we can bring more people along the journey of freedom, precious metals, and we can try to not only install financial and economic change, but political change as well.
Yeah, John, I think you certainly hit it on the head. We've been talking about debt all day. You just mentioned it again. I mean, yes, we're coming out of lockdowns, but the debt doesn't go away. And for people who may think that or how do we reduce the debt? We got to have more productivity. We got to be able to get things moving again. I'm afraid, people, that debt in a fiat currency world never gets repaid. It just keeps on going up. Because when you think about it, if we have greater GDP, the only way we get greater GDP is have more dollars flowing in the system. And where do the dollars come from? They get printed out of thin air. So it becomes debt paying off debt, and the interest rate is always in the middle. So, Darryl, I don't like what I see.
No, and so it emphasises once again how we always close making a reference to Jim Sinclair, having your own central bank. Central banks own gold. Why wouldn't you? Why do they own gold? To protect and back their currency, to give them power and influence. John mentioned that earlier today. It gives you influence. It gives you power and influence. It strengthens your position. Your resolve. Egon von Greyer's, of course. How much do you invest in precious metals right now? Egon, whatever you can't afford to lose. I don't like losing anything.
No.
So typically, what John was talking about it earlier, John's heavily into precious metals, as are we. We've been investing in precious metals now, Brian, as you know, 30 years. We just continue to add to our position. So Peter Daniels, we've mentioned Peter a number of times. Yes, John, you're right. No matter what poorly executed economic decisions are made in the world tonight, Peter will still party tomorrow. Of that there is no doubt, because he holds something of value, gold and silver, of course. John, thank you again. Thank you so much, mate, for your input. It's I keep saying it, you're beautifully researched, and you've been a wonderful acquisition here at As Good as Gold Australia. Let's look forward to that experience for many years to come. Thanks again, John. Thank you for our viewers and our subscribers who constantly support this channel. Until next time, stay well, stay focused, and goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now.